to episode 46 of our Lifestory podcast, brought to you by the Living Memory Association, based at the Wee Museum of Memory in Leith, Edinburgh. Today we're joined by Stuart Roy McIvor, who served with the Metropolitan Police for 30 years and as a City Councillor with the SNP for 5. Stuart's colourful and at times difficult life takes him from the capital of Scotland to Surrey, from Miami to Germany, and on to a remote Orkney island, before settling for now in his beloved Edinburgh. Back in time we go. Stuart McIvor, welcome to Lifestory. If you could just start off by telling us a little bit about how old you are and where you grew up.
Thanks very much, Barry, and thanks for inviting me here. Well, I'm going to be 78 in a couple of weeks. I'm Stuart Roy McIvor. I emphasise the Roy, the middle bit, because that was my father's name. I was born, actually, here in Leith, but didn't stay too long, because I was born in the old Eastern General Hospital. I was there, I believe, for a week and moved with my mother to Willow Brae. So that's actually where I started off from. But I'm proud of the fact that on my birth certificate it does say born in Leith, which, as we know, was a separate place altogether to Edinburgh. But I'm proud also to be, from Edinburgh generally.
Yeah. And to take us a little bit further back, Stuart, can you tell us a little bit about your parents and what they did?
Well, I was born right at the end of the war, February 1945, and sadly my father was killed a few weeks afterwards, barely a month before the actual end of the war in Europe in May 45. So, of course, I never knew him. I mean, it was one of those wartime things. He was on leave in London and met my mother. I never knew her either, because what happened was that she gave birth to me, as I've said, here. And we were staying with relatives of my father's family. So when the news came through that he'd been killed in Germany, to my great relief, really, looking back on it, my father's family sort of took charge of me, as it were. Bear in mind that the welfare state hadn't really got going. And so my mother went back, well, she was English, she went back to England, and she was married. But, this is wartime. I don't blame anybody for their actions. And so she disappeared out of my life for many years. She did come back into it a long time later. So I was basically brought up by my father's family, initially here in Edinburgh, and initially with my grandmother. And we lived in Lothian Road above, and it's still there, the Shakespeare pub. And it was a great place to be brought up, right in the heart of Edinburgh. Princess Street Gardens was my playground.
Yeah. And so is that where you'd hang about with your mates, Princess Street Gardens?
That's right, yeah. And I went to James Gillespie's school. And what's rather nice, that in the last few months I've come full circle. I moved a lot of times in my life, but now I'm back in a flat in Brunsfield, really just up the road from where I sort of started off with Granny in Lothian Road. And that's nice, it's all very familiar to me, the Brunsfield links, the meadows, all that sort of thing. So I'm so glad to be back in the area.
And is that first childhood home, is that still in the family, Stuart?
No.
What do you remember of that first childhood home when you picture
very
those
much.
days?
It's a huge apartment, huge. Granny ran not a very successful bed and breakfast business. I mean, it had 4 bedrooms, those huge high ceilings, those kind of tenements. No, and it wasn't a story of, all right, I knew the money was tight. We had a bathroom. We even had a telephone, which I suppose helped with the business. It was a good place to live. Yeah, Granny, who originated from the Highlands up in the northwest in Old Bay, she came to Edinburgh as a young woman. I think worked in hotels. Her husband, she did get married to somebody up in the north, but he died early. So there were various family members that really had misfortunes. And it was not unusual at the time, I think. They got on with it and never complained. I was lucky. I was lucky where I lived. And I was aware that when I went to school, that there were kids that didn't have bathrooms and toilets indoors. There were outside toilets. There were, cold water. They went to the steamiers, maybe once a week to have a bath, that sort of thing. No, I was fortunate. But, yeah, I do remember that Granny was a regular visitor to the pawnbrokers. Yeah. She had a fur coat which went backwards and forwards, like a shuttle.
And so was your granddad out working then, Stuart?
No, he was already passed away.
Oh, right. Okay, so it was just your granny. And you didn't have any contact with your mum's family at all? Were
Not
they
at
out
all.
of the picture? So it was just your granny?
Not at all back then, no.
Yeah. And is it a happy environment? What sort of granny was she? Did she rule with a rod of iron, or was she a laissez-faire sort of granny? What?
She was rather fierce. I was quite frightened of her. And I used to get the odd scalp from her, as they say, but nothing excessive. I mean, and I had a lot of freedom, but I was quite amused a few weeks ago where I saw something on social media where somebody referred to the fact that they had a lot of freedom as a kid, which nowadays they said would be called neglect. And maybe I wasn't. I didn't suffer from neglect, but I spent a heck of a lot of time, as us boys did back then, train spotting. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Princess Street Gardens was my playground, and being on one of the footbridges over the railway line, I'd be there with 10, 15, 20 boys, always boys, no girls, train spotting. And of course, it was still the old steam trains.
And was your granny a good cook? What sort of meals do you remember eating in the old days?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, good wholesome broths and things like that, stews. But she did make a meal which actually scared me because it was sheep's head broth. And she did get, this sheep's head from the butcher's up the road, and it would sit in this massive pot with lentils and carrots and God knows what. And it's a weird thing, which I never figured out, was I had this really scary great aunt who lived in Abbey Hill. Now, I mentioned Granny had a phone, but my great aunt didn't have a phone. But somehow, my great aunt, Etta was her name, seemed to know when this sheep's head broth was on the go. It was only made about once every 3 or 4 months. And she would appear, and I thought it was something sort of kind of mystical. She was a scary woman, very kind. Her story was that she had married a New Zealand soldier in the First World War. And promptly he went off to the front, and he was killed. And she actually got a war pension for the rest of her life. She never married again, which was a New Zealand war pension, which was rather better than apparently the British one. She used to buy my school uniform and things like that, though she always bought the best quality. There were various grades, rough, medium and luxurious. And I wish she didn't buy the best one, because us kids, you want to just sort of fit in. But so I had this rather swish type uniform and shoes and things. But that was so there again, I was lucky that I had her as a kind of backup to see I was okay.
What were your earliest friendships, Stuart? Who were the first mates that you remember hanging about with?
The usual thing, a wee gang at Gillespie's, 3 or 4 of us, especially a kid called Duncan, who I actually lived with him and his family in Queen Street for a year, because Granny sadly died from cancer fairly quickly. And I do remember what I feel brought on the cancer, I think, was one night. It was during the festival, and I could hear the pipe music and so on from the castle. That's how close we were, really. I'd gone to bed and was reading in bed when I heard an almighty bang from the kitchen. I jumped out of bed. At that time, I'd be about, I think, 10, 11, and ran into the kitchen, and Granny was lying on the floor. She'd got on a chair to replace a light bulb, and she'd fallen. And I thought at first she'd broken her leg. She was quite a large woman. And, here's the thing nowadays, the NHS and so on. So she insisted I get her up onto the sofa, which in the kitchen, a big kitchen. And I did somehow. And then ran for the doctor. Now, why we didn't phone, goodness knows. But she instructed me to run for the doctor. His surgery was round, or his home and surgery was in Castle Terrace. So it's now about, 9:30 at night. So I ran round there and knocked on the door. And it was like the old TV series, Dr. Finley's Casebook. Janet came to the door and opened it, and I said, quick, I need the doctor. She's fallen and broken her leg.
At that point in time, are you aware of the gravity of the situation? Yeah. Did you know it was something very serious?
Yeah, well, yes. It turned out she hadn't broken her leg. It was torn her ligaments, which can be worse, I believe. But and I remember I pulling the doctor by the arm back to the apartment. And he was a lovely old guy, and he was a Highlander, and he'd got his bag. And as we got to the sort of the door of the surgery, I suppose it was to calm me. he said, can you hear the pipes? And I said, yes, doctor. It was the lone piper up on the ramparts, you know. And he says, do you know what he's playing? I thought, God, does he not realise the seriousness of this? And I said, no, doctor, don't. No. I felt like saying that, I don't damn well care. And he said, it's Blue Bonnets Over the Border or something. Oh, anyway, we got there. And then the next thing was, Mrs. McIvor, or McIvor. My surname changes its pronunciation. Mrs. McIvor, what you done? And then Granny says she liked to drink. She said, Stuart, get the doctor a drink. The whiskey's in the this cupboard. I thought, I didn't know about that one. And then the doctor said, no, it's all right. I've got my own here. I got some here. And he brought out half bottle from his bag. And I thought, there they are. And of course, it was the old Highland thing of exchanging pleasantries before they got down to business. And I'm sitting there. I'm the 10-year-old kid. And I thought, these ruddy adults don't understand. There's a bit. Anyway, eventually, we called for that. We did use the phone that time. Called for the ambulance. So I was left very, very worried. And we did have 2 guests in at the time, but they were what we called commercial travellers in those days. Anyway, at some point during the night, she came back, and her leg was all strapped up. Yeah. Then in the morning, she sat there in the kitchen directing me, and I made breakfast for the 2 guests. But the thing I really do remember after that was that she asked me to go up to Torcross, to the post office that was there then, to send a telegram to her. She had 2 daughters, both in London, to ask them to come up, one of them to come up to help. I went to the post office. I had to queue, very big queue, and get the telegram form. I'd never filled one in before. But I'd had a Granny had written on a piece of paper what I should write. So I wrote it, joined the queue again, got to the front of the queue, and the woman assistant said I hadn't filled it in properly. She gave me another form, and, so back I went, rewrote it, joined the same long queue. Eventually she accepted it, took the money, and I went outside the post office and threw up in the gutter. I was so, worked up, and I understood the meaning of being sick with worry, literally. And I thought that was kind of cruel that she knew, obviously, from reading what I'd written, what it was about. It was a traumatic event. And so I think that's, in my later career, I was fortunate as a police officer to help people and be aware of that kind of thing, helping, especially young people, wherever, trying to make it easier for them. So that, brought on the cancer, which developed very quickly. And so she went down to London to stay with my aunt and then ended up in hospital in Chelsea. And so that last year at Gillespie's, I spent with my friend Duncan in Queen Street. And so, of course, the next thing is, where do I go secondary school? And I have to say, in those days, for some reason, never understood, James Gillespie's, there was the boys' school and the girls' school at the Links.
And Stuart, are they both fee-paying schools in these days, Gillespie's?
Well, they were, but even for then, it was £3 a term, which wasn't exactly much.
Yeah.
They were still corporation schools. We called them merchant schools. There were a few in Edinburgh. So we were and we weren't, but we had a smart maroon uniform. So for some reason, the boys' school was only primary. There was no secondary Gillespie's for boys, though there was for the girls. But really, the problem was going to be, where was I going to go to secondary school and where was I going to live? And the solution came up with my aunt, one of my aunts in London, Aunt Ina, who somehow, she obviously did a bit of research, as we'd say, and found out that I might be entitled to a Ministry of Defence scholarship, get paid if I went to, a public school, a boarding school, which would solve the problem of accommodation. And that's what happened. I managed to get into a public school in Surrey. And so my education was split between Edinburgh and Surrey. And then in the holidays, I went to stay with my aunt in Chelsea, or an uncle who I got very friendly with, who lived in Wiltshire, in a delightful place in Wiltshire. And he was a great character, and it was quite an influence on me, because I was lacking, a father figure. And he and his wife, lovely wife, they sort of doted on me, but we used to get up to some great adventures. He'd had a very exciting war career. He was from here, from the Highlands, then Edinburgh, and then, down south. But he ended up as a major, but he'd fought with the Greek partisans and all sorts. And all right, soldiers don't tell lots of stories, but little things came out. Yeah, so he was a great influence, not always for the good. But he taught me to drive. And I would drive his great big Austin Somerset around the lanes of Wiltshire, by now, I guess, 12, driving on the public road, and the village copper. Well, he knew who I was. I was kind of exempt because I was referred to as the Major's boy.
Yeah.
So the Major was highly respected in the neighbourhood. So as I was the Major's boy, yeah, because I used to drive on my own sometimes. He'd send me he liked to drink too, has to be said, and he'd send me to the pub to get supplies.
So when did the driving test come in? In those days, did you just learn to drive and then you were off and away? Well, do you remember when
No, there was a test.
There was a test.
Was already I think the test came in just before the war.
Right.
No, it was in. But it did mean that when I eventually did take the test in London, well, I had just 3 driving lessons just to kind of get me in, what's required for the test. And I managed to pass after the three lessons, and I got my licence in 19. But thanks to him, it was kind of a doddle, because this Austin Somerset was a great big heavy car to drive. I used to sit on a cushion, and I was still in shorts when I first started driving. And he used to, sit next to me, and if I wasn't doing something properly or whatever, missed a gear, he would slap me on my thigh. But no, he was a great guy. Yeah, so I'm grateful for his driving lessons.
Let's nip back just for a second to Gillespie's primary up in Edinburgh. Yeah. Are those happy memories? Are those happy days, being at that school in primary level?
Yeah. It was a very good education. I should say, briefly, I'd gone to London, and it was a dreadful school in London, Streatham, South London, sorry.
Is this before primary level, or is this before
This is primary, yeah, sorry. I went with another uncle. From what I understood, there was a kind of a rota system, which did break down at one point, where I went from one member of my father's family to another. So they'd moved from Edinburgh down to South London, and I went to this awful school, which was bomb damaged. I mean, there was still a big hole in the roof of tarpaulin and God as well. And the class, from memory, seemed to be about 50, 60 people. And I was about the youngest. Dreadful teacher. And they deemed me, sorry, I really have to point this out. They deemed me as backward. I wasn't learning, I couldn't read or write. I just wasn't getting anywhere. And they deemed me as backward. And my aunt, the 2 aunts in London, plus my granny, they were in touch with her, obviously, and they decided that I should definitely return to Edinburgh, because in those days, Scottish education was certainly seen as a lot better than English. And I do remember, going for an interview with James Gillespie's lovely old headmaster, and he said to me, yeah, well, you've been at school in London, you don't know anything, so you better come here and we'll teach you.
And what age are you at this point, sorry, Stuart, roughly?
At 8, 7 or 8.
Right.
Yeah. And now, here you are, I distinctly remember the day that I could suddenly read. I was sitting in class in Gillespie's. We had a lovely, lovely lady teacher, Miss Scott, and she had stuff written up on a blackboard. And suddenly it was like a net curtain being drawn to one side. Suddenly the words on the blackboard, I could read them, just like that. I think I'd only been at Gillespie's about 3 weeks when that happened. And from then on, English, reading and all that became my most favourite subject. And spelling, for instance, I used to have a spelling test every morning from the Chanel spelling book, I remember that. And I always got good marks, 9 or 10 out of 10.
So were you a well-behaved kid at primary school?
No, I was Mr. Average. And there you are, you see, when you say you've been to boarding school, which I did, people got ideas about boarding school. But the difference was night and day, really, when it came to discipline. At Gillespie's, they were fair, but it was... You got the strap. Mm-hmm. And you got the strap for very, very minor things. I got the strap once for my pencil. I hadn't sharpened it enough. I thought that was unfair. And you got a belt across the hand for,
And was it an actual belt, Stuart, or was it a toes, like a split-in belt?
Yeah, we called it the belt, but it was a toes, yeah.
Yeah, which was even more painful than the normal.
Oh, yeah. And some of the teachers were a bit malicious. They'd push the sleeve jacket up, the toes, the belt, hit you on the lowest, that soft bit of the wrist. That really hurt and left a mark. It could be there for days. But no, it's Mr. Average or Master Average. Probably got the belt. 2-3 times a week. But then bad boys got it maybe 6-7 times a week. Very few of the kids hardly ever got it. Everybody got it.
Yeah.
And so when I went to the boarding school in Surrey, and you hear the stories, about punishments, and of course you hear about prefects are allowed to beat you. No, I went to a very liberal school, and I never got beaten at all in the 5 years I was at the boarding school.
That's good to hear in those days. And how did you take to living away from home at a boarding school?
I really enjoyed it. I think it was, I got a stability, and the staff. And I've been at reunions at the school. Shall I name it? Shall I name the school?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Well, it's King Edward's. There's a few King Edwards, but this is the one in Surrey, near Godalming. And it was actually founded in 1553, so it's been around a lot. Moved to Surrey from London in the sort of late 1800s. Pretty grim-looking Victorian building, but we had wonderful grounds, about 60 acres, I think. I think, and the staff were... And that's been verified when I've been to reunions. I said, have I got this wrong? But I don't. I seem to remember the staff being sort of really kind, decent, so on. And they said, yeah, that's right. So I think that was it. I had this stability, and there was minimal bullying. So it was, I guess, fairly untypical of English public schools of that era. I do remember wondering when I was going to get whatever they had as a punishment. And I got a bit naughty. I was trying to test the system, and eventually I got a message. Some kid came into the class, said the headmaster wants to see you. Oh, here we go, Mr. Humphreys. And so I went up, and huge room, and he's behind the desk wearing his robe and everything, Oh, and he said, right, sit down, McIvor. They always called you by surnames, as we boys did, and girls. Sorry, it was a girls' school. I forget that because they hadn't long been co-ed, so they were very scared that we'd kind of fraternise a bit too much. So they kept the girls pretty separate. And at times I think I went to a boys' school, but there were girls there. I've forgotten about the girls.
So were the girls' dorms far away from the boys' dorms?
Yeah, they were in a separate building, and we only came together at class. And then even in class, they were on one side of the room and we were on the other. And we ate in the main dining room, but they had their own tables and we had ours. But
was there no fraternising at all? No people trying to cross that divide?
Kind of tried, yeah, but it was, well, I did try, but if it went too far, I know a friend of mine, and he went too far, was found in the drying room with his girlfriend, and we never saw him again. They were both expelled that night. We didn't see them, they'd gone in the morning, But no, it was a good school. And I feel very lucky to have gone there. And thanks to the MOD. And there was a bit of wangling there, actually, because my father was only a sergeant when he died, was killed. And this grant was really only for officers' kids. And my aunt, I don't know how she did it, but she managed to get in touch with the commanding officer who was retired, or was my father's commanding officer. And he wangled it. He basically said, well, this Sergeant McIvor, if he'd lived, would have been an officer. and that's how it was wangled. And I'm forever grateful for that too, that happened. Yeah.
And so after what's obviously a happy time at school, where does the path take you next? When you were at school, did you have any vision of what you wanted to do when you left? No, not really. Not until very late on. And it was kind of the same problem came up again 5 years on. I was five years there when I realised I was going to finish school fairly soon. And I didn't, obviously I was going to do a job. I needed to do a job, but accommodation again, because I knew I couldn't really stay with my aunt. Wasn't expected. And, I remember I'd already thought about it. I had thought about it. One of the things about living in Lothian Road above the Shakespeare, and it's still there. The police box on the corner, still there. And I used to look out at the bedroom window and see the bobbies coming and going all the time, the old Edinburgh City Police. And I respected them. They were fine men, they were so smart, the way they conducted themselves. And they were constantly coming and going. I saw them all the time. I remember there was an accident in the street just outside, and the way they dealt with it, I watched how they measured up the damage and things. I was just so impressed. But I was hitchhiking. I only had about 3 or 4 months left to do at school. I was hitchhiking back to London from Edinburgh. In those days, we used to hitchhike a lot. I used to hitchhike frequently between London and Edinburgh
kept coming back here for holidays to stay usually with my friend Duncan's parents. So I was going back and I was in Berwick-on-Tweed, just on the other side of the bridge there. And a wee Ford Prefect pulled up with a guy driving. So we get in, asked me how far I was going. I said, well, I'm hoping to get to London. And he said, well, I'm not going far. He said, I'm only going about 3 miles. So it was a lousy lift, except he started questioning me, and it turned out he was a off-duty policeman from Berwick. And he says, how much longer you got at school? And I said, I don't know, 3 months. So what are you going to be doing? And I said, I don't really know. And he said, you don't know? And he sort of kind of told me off. And he looked me up and down. I was sitting there. And he said, you thought about the police, which, as I said, I kind of had. He said, well, I think you should. I think that'd be something you could do. Right, get out. I'm turning off here. I think that was a catalyst. And I was impressed with the fact that he took an interest. And again, when I did become a police officer, I sort of tried to, help people and suggest things to people. And what you don't know, and I wish I'd been able to get in touch with that policeman in years later, that he didn't know when I got out of the car. He probably thought to himself, well, that was a waste of time, Speaking to him, just useless. But you don't know the seed that you may have planted.
Yeah.
And it may be that what you said might not actually come to fruition. So maybe a few years down the line, wait a minute, that guy said something. And so I'm aware of that, and I try and tell people, if you're giving advice, particularly the youngsters, they just sort of sometimes, yeah, thanks, no thanks, and it's a bit off-putting. But I say you just never know when you've placed a seed, and that off-duty officer did. So, of course, then what I did, I tried to join the old Edinburgh City Police, and the height requirement then was 6 feet, which was common for some reason in the city forces more than the other ones.
How tall were you at this point?
Well, only 5'10.5". But then I was only, be 17. And of course, you can't be, even now, a constable until you're 19. But of course, they had the cadet system, which kind of varied from force to force, where you could join younger. The idea of the cadet system, which is no longer with us, there are sort of voluntary things, but was to grab kids from school, in those days just boys, and keep them till they were 19, because they realised that a kid might leave school, say, I want to be a policeman, but I can't be one till I'm 19, so I'll get another job or something in the meantime, and then they settle into that job, and they don't actually come into the police. So the cadets was a way of grabbing kids from school. So I said this to him, I said, well, I want to be a cadet. And he said, how tall are you? He measured me 5'10.5". He says, oh, you're too small. And I said, well, I'm still growing. Well, I wasn't. Didn't grow anymore. And no, he says, the sergeant. He said, just go away and join the dwarves in London. It's only 5'8" there. That's in the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah.
And that was true. And that's what I did. And I'm glad I did, because I think I had a more varied career down there.
And so what was the process in those days of joining the Met then? Was there a cadet system down there as well?
Yeah.
Or?
Oh, yeah. And it was a very good one. Probably it was, the Met's the best at everything. But I think it was the best cadet systems in the UK, run by a wonderful guy, the Commandant. That was his title. He wasn't a policeman, though he did wear a uniform. His wartime title, Colonel Croft, that's what we called him, Colonel Croft, who'd been, before the war, an Arctic explorer, an adventurer, and had another guy who had an exciting war career. And he lived, on the training school at Hendon. So, and he'd been invited to set up the Met Police Cadet School. So when I went there, I thought, good God, I'm back at boarding school. He set it up just like an English public school. We had houses the same as I'd had at the boarding school. So the houses were named after previous Met Police commissioners. And dormitory, all that sort of thing. And I mean, punishments now, we didn't call it in my boarding school, but an old-fashioned term for sort of discipline if you get punished. We call it, at the training school, they call it jankers. That's a really old sort of funny name. I couldn't believe it. I thought, I'm back at boarding school like this. And plenty of outdoor activity and all that, but also useful things like learning to type. And that was a wonderful Scottish lady who taught us typing. Keep your fingers on the keys, boys. Always fingers on the keys, boys. Yeah, the cadets were wonderful. You spent a while at the training school, then you get sent to a police station in London, and I was sent to Putney, fairly quiet sort of place, and then you go out with constables, but you go on the area cards we call it. That's nowadays what we call the response card, deals with the 999 calls. And of course, you sat there very quietly, the boy in the back of the car, big old black walls, and because the coppers then they were all wartime. They all had been through the war, and sometimes even the constables, you didn't call them by their first name, you called them Mister, Mister. But there were some great, wonderful characters amongst them.
Can you remember the first time when you had to actually get into the action as opposed to sitting and observing what was going on?
Well, I can certainly remember in the back of the area car once, and we're driving along, and I think it was a youth who, as we'd say, done something, and when he saw us, he ran off. And all that happened was the radio operator who sat in the front passenger seat, he just leant back and opened the door for me at the back, just grabbed hold of the handle, opened the door, and said, "Get him." I was off like a greyhound because we were very fit.
Yeah.
They didn't even get out of the car. And I went like this greyhound across down the street and whatever, and caught him, no bother at all. Jumped on him, grabbed him around the neck and pulled him back. And that was my first arrest, though it wasn't put down to me. They claimed it.
That's one of the great mysteries to me, is how in these modern times policemen in shoes ever catch kids and trainers. I
know, I can't see how it's done, no.
But you were just fit and fast in those days.
Yeah, well, all us cadets were, and the police generally were a lot fitter back then. When I first started, the Panda car system hadn't come in, and you could actually do the whole of your service at a place like London on the beat. You never had any promotion, but even then, sergeants patrolled the beat too. Well, their job was slightly different in that their job really was to try and catch out the beat bobbies, make sure they're on the beats that they should be on.
The cadet school, Stuart, did everyone who went through the training pass, or were there a few dropouts, or did most of them, if you were in, that was you were going to get through?
Okay, we had tests, and you had to pass them, and they were very frequent, and there were two big ones. The probationary period, it was very stringent. It became obvious to even us fellow cadets that somebody wasn't going to make the grade. And this is where I think about now. I know there's been a pandemic, and recruits have been doing it online and not been at a training school, and I don't quite understand what the system is. Some of them do university courses, then straight into the police, and they've not really been observed by instructors, police instructors, or fellow pupils. And we would talk amongst ourselves and say, that John Smith or whatever, he ain't going to make it. And more often than not, they did. In those days, and sometimes, you'd be in class one day, and then the next, it wasn't there, and you'd make inquiries and say, what was the expression? Unlikely to make the grade. And during probation, the same as a constable, for 2 years you were on probation, you could be chucked just like that. There was no redress. They just off you went.
And within that cadet system, Stuart, once you got into it, did you think, yes, this is the job for me, this is where I want to be? Yeah,
absolutely,
right from the start.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about nowadays, because I'm on a couple of social media, retired police social media sites, and we do talk about the police family. And I will say, particularly the Met, I guess, I've had a couple of disastrous relationships, really, especially my marriage, which broke up, and I was sad about that. The one consistency has been what we now call the police family. They've always been there to support me, whether it's the institution itself or the fellow officers. Who now I'm no longer in it, but I supported somebody where I'd worked with at Chelsea all those years ago, and his brother had moved to Edinburgh and died sadly in his flat here about 3 years ago. And he phoned me up and he said, "Look, I'm not getting any answer from my brother. I'm worried about him. Could you go around there at the flat?" So it was Fountain Bridge. And I went round and made inquiries, as they say, and nobody's seen him for ages. So I just got onto the police and told them, and they came along and they pushed the door in, and he'd been dead a few weeks, actually. Somebody pointed it out to me, the film, which I love actually. And there's a bit in that, and I'm terrible at remembering names of actors and whatnot, but there's a bit towards the end where the main character, the faded rock star, goes to see his Christmas Eve, is on New Year's Eve, he goes to see his long-suffering Scottish agent, and I wish I could remember his name, a well-known Scottish actor.
Yeah, the guy who plays Ramsay Nesbitt.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And he says he's very awkward and embarrassed. He says, and of course his agent is very surprised to see him. What are you doing here? I thought you'd be out partying with the women and all that. And he says, you know what? He says he's very awkward. he says, I've come to realise that you have been the one strength in my life that I could always rely on you, and I've got to apologise that I, took you for granted, but now I know. And it was kind of, they're all terribly embarrassed, and they give us sort of man hug. And I realised that somebody said that, an ex-policeman said that. He said, Stuart, it's the one thing in our lives has been the police family. They're there, and they're still there till your day that you die. Yeah. So it's kind of comforting, isn't it?
So can you take me through your move through the ranks then, Stuart? When did the promotions happen, and what stations were you at? How did it unfold?
Promotions weren't too great, I have to say that. Did get into trouble a couple of times, which kind of did slow it up. I never got beyond sergeant, though I often did duty as acting inspector, duty officer. But actually a part of me didn't really want to get promotion, in that the more you get promoted, the more, you become a desk person.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much as a sergeant, but I liked being in the front line. But then I had diversions, let's say, that took me away doing other things which were very different, Took me to Germany and to California for a short while.
And what was that involved with, roughly?
I can't say too much about it even now, but it was to...
Can you give even a general, the kind of crime and investigations it was to do with, or is even that too much to give out?
It was, let's say, a bit informal. The Germany thing was Berlin when the wall came down. I'd had this contact with this sort of, let's say, an anonymous department, very small department. Nobody's got to kind of belong to it permanently. You came and went when needed, and I'd made contact with it. I found out about it by accident in the late 60s. And it literally operated out more or less a broom cupboard at Scotland Yard. And it was to keep tabs. It didn't fit in with Special Branch. It was to keep tabs on whatever they felt. So I was asked to go to Berlin at short notice, very short notice, to make contact with a senior officer in East Berlin. So I had to cross into East Berlin, which was quite sort of scary at the time. The wall was coming down and people were beginning to flow backwards and forwards. But I remember went through... It was Friedrichstrasse station, was it? And it was like leaving West Berlin behind. It was like, broad Technicolor. And suddenly I'm in black and white era again. It was, So I made contact with this officer. I was very relieved to get back to the West again, West Berlin. The California thing was to try and observe, let's say, people or the chap that had been involved with terrorist stuff.
Right.
And that's about it, really. Other stuff, it was just drugs and things, yeah.
What aspect of policing did you enjoy the most, Stuart?
I think the time that I enjoyed the most was when I was what they called a home beat officer, Battersea, South London. Battersea was a very working class area at that time, just across the river from Chelsea. The contrast is huge, and I knew Chelsea very well. And the home beat officer idea came into being in the late 60s in London, where already then they were getting worried about fewer officers patrolling beats. They had brought the Panda car system in, so there was more officers driving, and people were leaving the job because there was better pay elsewhere. So they came up with this, they call them community officers now, and so I volunteered, and I was given a beat in, it was Lavender Hill, which is part of Battersea, Clapham Junction, and it was great. Big mix of people, quite a few pop stars. I remember Brian Ferry was a neighbour, and also they wanted you to live on the beat, and I did. And we had a lovely wee cottage which was rented, so it wasn't police quarters, because in those days, see, that's another thing, was you got accommodation. But the rent was paid for me by the police, but I had this refurbished cottage on this small 19th century estate. I did that job for over 6 years, and I really did get to know the community. You're absolutely involved with it. There was also on the other side of the beat, there was a strong, in those days we called it a West Indian community. Now I think they're called Afro-Caribbean. And there were problems more with the youngsters. There was a clash of cultures, but not just the cultures with us, with their parents. Their parents, you see, having come from Caribbean, they were very strong and disciplined. And frankly, used to sort of beat the kids quite a lot, especially the boys. And they drag their sons up to the police station sometimes and ask us to beat them. And we said, no, we don't do that. And they get upset with us, apparently and they were mainly from Jamaica or Trinidad. I was so involved with them that I could often tell which islands people came from, but principally they were from Jamaica or Trinidad. And apparently the Jamaican police would beat people to order, but we didn't. So there was conflict there Well, my wife, sorry to admit, but no, she was a teacher on my beat, and she experienced similar kind of problems. Looking back on it, we never had any sort of discussions or advice or talks, whatever, on, cultural matters. It would have been good if we could have sat down, sort of a community type event to sit down and sort of discuss and explain things. It coincided too, which I think is still around, it coincided with the, let's say, left-wing agitation, which was very much in the 60s, the 70s, anti-police. And there was ridiculous advice given to these West Indian people, or people of colour, to say that if they were stopped by police, and of course this is such a big topic still, stop and search, that if they were stopped by police and they knew they'd done nothing wrong, they should just run away. It was crazy advice. And then, well, of course, you stop a black kid for whatever reason, and suddenly runs off. But what do? You think, he must have done something. So you're after him. And like I said, we were fairly fit. Call up a car maybe. And then, there'd be a bit of a bundle, let's say, back to the police station. And unbelievably, after lots of questioning and inquiries and the proper searching of him, find that he'd done nothing wrong. And it was that sort of mad advice. I've been stopped by the police a number of times over the years, off duty and now retired, in Scotland, England, Ireland, and places, France. And I know that, well, they've got the upper hand if you get stopped. And so it's yes, sir, no, sir. And I've never had any, usually there's an apology and away I go.
And I take it there's obviously a regret there that you couldn't manage more liaison with that community and build some bridges. Yeah,
it's sad. It's still going on somewhat. But no, I mean, it wasn't all bad. I mean, we used to have great banter with certainly the older West Indians. But I did get quite a lot of the youngsters round to my side, being the home beat officer. So I hope I did some good there.
And did you ever have any problem with, I take it where you lived was known in the local community what your house was? Did you have any trouble with the fact that people knew that there was a police officer living there? No?
No, and that's quite funny in a sense, because I went to... Well, I can tell you this, Barry. I've been the kiss of death to every police station I've ever worked at. And so I started at Putney. Then it was Lavender Hill, which is part of Battersea. I mean, Battersea was a tiny borough. It's been absorbed into Wandsworth. Had 3 police stations. They've all gone. Anyway, then I went to Fulham. Then I went to Notting Hill. Then I went to Chelsea. All shut. Apart from Lavender Hill, kind of, which is Clapham Junction. It's only survived because it's part of the Magistrates Court building, I would say. So I was down there about 4 or 5 years ago and stayed in the travel lodge in Clapham Junction. So in the evening I walked up the hill to the police station, and it took me ages to get in, ringing bells, and nobody came. I mean, that was a great thing. Police stations then, people could just walk in off the street, and sometimes you get kind of down and out, so we'd come in sometimes and just sit in a chair for a while and rest, and you give them a cup of tea or something. Anyway, so I went up there and rang on the bell, and eventually a lady buzzed me in. I went in, and so I went in, and I was looking around, and she said, "You look lost." And I said, "No, it's the opposite. I'm just familiarising myself with the building that I knew so well." I said, "I used to work it." And she said, "Oh, you were a policeman here?" I said, "Yeah, in the 60s into the 70s. And she was a civilian. And there was only her in this big building and another lady who never spoke. And what they said, there's no police officers here, it's just us. We take messages or whatever. I don't know what they did, really. She did inquire. She said, "So where did you live when you worked here?" And I said, "Well, actually, I lived down on the Shaftesbury estate, on the beat that I was responsible for." And she said, "They let you live?" I said, "In the area in which you worked?" I said, "Well, yeah. Wasn't that dangerous?" I said, "No, not really." I said, it used to be a bit annoying at times because people would knock on your door. I remember once I just sat down to tea, and somebody came to the door and said, "The old boy a few doors down, I think he's in a bad way." So I went down there, and he was dead. And I sort of, he was on the floor, and this guy helped get him up into dignified position on a chair sort of thing. An ambulance was called, and an on-duty police officer did arrive. So, and I was back home within probably 20 minutes, and my wife got the meal back out of the oven or something. And I sat there, and she asked me, I said, "Oh, I had to manhandle him onto the armchair." And she said, "Aren't you going to wash your hands?" I said, "He was perfectly clean." But no, I mean, this lady in the police station, she said, "God, they're not allowed to now. You would never live on your manor, as we used to call it.
Yeah.
It's sad, very sad.
So I take it, did you meet your wife out socialising in the local area then?
When I was a policeman, much to my annoyance, I was cadet at Putney, which was rather a quiet place back then. I was sent back there. Nobody ever heard of that as a PC, as a constable. I was furious because I still kind of treated as if I was a cadet by some of the older policemen, make the tea boy sort of thing, because cadets always had to make the tea. Didn't learn to make good, strong tea. So I was a bit annoyed about that. I was back there for 18 months or so, but then I managed, there was some vacancies at Lavender Hill, so I applied to go there. So what was the question again?
It was just, where did you meet your wife? Really?
Oh, so yes. Gosh, on the flick of a coin, back at Putney, school crossing patrol. We had two, and I'd come on duty on the late shift, 2:00 in the afternoon, and there were only two of us, which was unusual then. I mean, that's another thing. We could easily, a quiet place like Putney on a shift, or relief as we call them in London, you could have 6, 7 officers on foot. Then you'd have the area car. You'd have a van and a little Velocet motorbike, which I was sent to run motorbike, training. I didn't have a motorbike license, and that was wonderful when I was able to ride that around, because you had a radio on as well, because we didn't have radios to begin with. So anyway, we come on duty, rather cold, miserable April day, and the sergeant said, well, boys, what you got to do? We got 2 school crossings, and there's only 2 of you. And one was just along the road at Putney Hill, see the girls from the girls' school there. And the other one was a good mile and a half or so away at Roehampton, and that was not a popular one. So anyway, I lost. So he said, well, make it fair, we'll toss for it. You'll toss for it, and I lost it. So I got the Roehampton one. So I went out there, cold, blustery April day, and it was a primary school, and you could see all the kids going out. I knew they were all out, but you had a set time, and it wasn't up. And I thought, the kids are out. But I thought, no, you just don't know. I better keep to the time, not leave early. Because say there was a kid, imagine if something happened to a kid when you were meant to be there. So I stood there feeling rather cold and bored when a bus pulled up opposite. A few people got off, and as a policeman, I know they weren't children, but I went out into the road and put my hand up, stopped the traffic. There's half dozen people, including this nice young lady. And the rest is history.
And do you have family, Stuart?
Yes, I got a boy. He became a policeman.
So
he's now retired. He's now retired, unbelievably.
Oh,
he joined the Met, but then transferred to Avon and Somerset and based in Bristol. But now he's had quite an adventurous career, because he served 3 tours in Afghanistan, mentoring the Afghanistan police. Quite dangerous at times. Yeah. So he did a total of 18 months as a policeman, but in Afghanistan, on secondment, as it were. Quite extraordinary. And
did you feel worry about that day to day, or
not knowing? No, you can't.
Yeah. Was he in touch much when he was over there?
Yes.
I take it that he'd be angry the way they've been abandoned, basically.
Yes, he is. It's sad what happened at Kabul. It really is.
And you touched on the end of your marriage. It's okay if you don't want to talk about this, but was it the job, do you think? Was it the being in the police that?
Yeah, partly, I would say. Yeah, well, it was a big regret. I'm still friendly with my ex-wife, though sadly she's now, I think, got a bit of dementia. So I'm not sure if when I phone her, which is not often, about twice a year really, she doesn't. I'm not sure if she even knows who I am now. That's sad, because a year younger than me. But I do remember this. I mean, she was a student teacher when I met her, and she lived in this squalid conditions in this rented house with other female students. It was awful. I started dating her. I went in once to meet her. It's very fortunate I'd got a car, because the wages weren't good, but I did have a wee car. And having gone inside once, I said, never again, I'll wait for you outside. I'll bang on the door and say, I'm waiting for you. So, but when we got married, so then I was living in single men's quarters in Putney, but then we're given a flat, police flat. It was modern. I think the Met Police had a scheme after the war where they built a lot of new accommodation. And it was always on old bomb sites, there were plenty of them. And these flats, well, it was in Stockwell in South London, but that's, I don't know, a mile and a half, say, from Houses of Parliament. That's central.
Yeah.
And she couldn't believe it, nor could I really. It was in a terrace block of private flats, mock Tudor, and there's this rather modern block stuck in the middle. Massive gardens at the front and the back. I remember we got the key and we went in. 3 bedrooms. It was massive. No furniture or anything. And she couldn't believe it. She said, is this ours? Yeah. And we had no furniture, really. We just got bare basics, but she invited, or we invited some of her friends round, or her student friends. They had to bring sleeping bags, stay for the weekend or whatever, and they just couldn't believe it. And they were pretty jealous of my wife. They said, God, you got all this room. Yeah, had lovely. We couldn't afford carpets, but it had wonderful tiles, marley tiles, which polish up. So we had a couple of rugs and things. And where was I? Somewhere on duty, junk shop. There were loads of junk shops around Battersea, and I saw this industrial polisher. They're used in hospitals and places. 2 massive sort of wheeled things. And I think I got it for like 3 shillings. And got the police van it was heavy as hell. And got the police van to take it back to the flat. She loved it. She was, my wife, the floors became rather dangerous actually because it was so shined by this damn great industrial polisher thing. But it was good. And it was great sort of gradually getting stuff, furniture, and I've still got a couple of items, to sort of treasure them. It's not just furniture now, it's sort of memories of just looking at them.
And so how long were you in the force for in the end, Stuart? Did you do 30 years? Or?
I did my 30. What happened was that drink became a bit of a problem. I think it kind of ran in the family with my father's family. But after I was separated, divorced, and I have to say the drink was, I think the CID, for instance, ran on alcohol in those days. It's not now. It was just a different way of life back then, I think. So, I had far more time in my hands. I was back in single men's quarters for a while. I did buy, and this is unbelievable, I did actually buy a 2-bedroom house in London on my own, just like that. But I wasn't terribly happy there. Then I bought a flat, in Battersea, overlooking the river. But too much time on my hands and drinking with pals and whatnot. By the time my 30 was approaching, I realised I had a drink problem. I was worried I could get into trouble. And by this time, I'd bought a cottage or a croft house up in Orkney on one of the outer islands, which wasn't from the drinking side, wasn't a brilliant idea. But I loved it there, and I was up there last year. It's long sold, and that's where I retired to. And so I got out, but I didn't really have a proper plan. And I was only 49, done 30 years plus the 2 as a cadet. They don't count towards pensionable service. But really, I got out because of the drink, really, that it was getting the better of me.
And how did you take to civilian life? Well,
on the island, I got in with a good crowd or a bad crowd, some might say. Crofters. They were hard-working guys, fishermen, or crofting, that sort of thing.
Hard drinking guys as well.
Hard drinking, but there's lots of. We did our own socialising back then. I'm talking about when I got the cottage. It was the 80s. There was still lots of fiddle music and so on, and so there was sort of self-entertainment. It was great. I love the crack. That's the word, the crack. No, I'm still friendly with people up there. And I was up, as I say, last year. I was up for a week, and it was great.
And what brought you back to Edinburgh in the end?
Well, partly a drink. I thought this ain't any good. I'm only now 50, say, and I've got to do something. So Edinburgh was the obvious place. And back here, I joined a well-known self-help group. They were a huge help, and I'm still with them. And I haven't had a drink probably in about 20 years.
Do you still think about it?
No. I hope that doesn't sound too glib.
No, I mean...
I reached a stage where, no. I mean, we just had...
How long did that take, then, to not think about it anymore, do you think?
5 or 6 years at least. And at one time, I thought I'd never get on top of this. I'd go for months without a drink, and then suddenly something would happen. And I'd start drinking. And of course, it was always worse, because if you've been off it for any period of length of time, for some reason, you resume drinking in the same way as you did when you were before. You don't start with just a wee half pint or something. No, you're straight back into how you drank when you were at your worst. Well, of course, because you haven't had a drink for a number of months, it hits you. And I was getting ill very quickly. It was awful. But I made it in the end, thanks to the self-help group, which has the name, part of the name, because we are anonymous.
Yeah. Well done you.
No, that's another thing. I mean, I still go to meetings maybe 2 or 3 times a month now. Not because I feel that helps you stay away from the drink, because I just don't think about it. But now I go to help what we call newcomers.
Yeah.
to try and help them and say, look, that you too can get there. Just, persevere and you'll get there. If I can do it, you will be able to do it. So that's why I go now. I'm seen as an old hand, which is quite a nice feeling.
And you retired young, Stuart. How did you fill that? Did you ever take on another job?
Yeah.
How did you fill that time?
I became a tour guide. Well, on the island, don't get the idea I was drunk all the time. No. I helped out wherever. I used to love helping out on the farms or the crops, anything that was going. I drove there was, at that time, the new ferries came on scene, which are the roll-on, roll-offs. Before that, and we had 3 for the outer islands. Before that, had only been 1, an old ferry where literally cars were, for instance, everything was lifted up over the side. But the roll-on, roll-offs actually changed the atmosphere on the islands. People could go into town, that's Kirkwall, on the roll-offs, as they do, go in the morning and come back in the afternoon, so go and visit Tesco's. Prior to that, you just couldn't go in on the ferry. The ferry, I think, only came around about 3 times a week and went around all the islands. You couldn't go in for the day. If you went in on the ferry, you would have to stay overnight. So the islands, the outer isles, the North Isles, were far more self-sufficient. Yeah. Anyway, so I drove, when the roll-on, roll-offs came, I for a while drove the truck that went into town in the morning on the ferry and got stuff, that anybody had ordered at the various shops around Kirkwall or even over in Stromness. And I enjoyed that. I spent an awful lot of time on the ferry. The ferry from where I was staying took an hour and a half into town, so that's 3 hours a day, and I did that for a while. Then I took a job on Skye, and I was driving a bus there, and I was very much, I had to be off the drink. Those Sundays were a bit mad. We didn't work on a Sunday. They still had this thing on Skye back then. It's a Sabbath. You don't work on the Sabbath. So we used to have a few drinkies, let's say, on a Sunday. It was a bit of a mad day, but very enjoyable, So I came back down to Edinburgh thinking I've got to try and, be... I've always felt I'd gravitate to Edinburgh. I mean, when I got married, I said to my wife, we'll be living in Scotland when I retire. And, will we? She was from East Anglia. But she came up to Scotland a number of times. And she did like it here, but it was never to be, of course, sadly. We were married about 13 years. But and then, of course, I settled in Edinburgh and became, by this time I am on top of the drink, and I became a local councillor of the City of Edinburgh Council, the SNP, for 5 years. So that was quite something. Mm-hmm. But an awful lot of that was kind of like my police stuff when I was a home beat officer, just helping people with things and knowing how to get stuff done without sort of going through the red tape business, we'll do it this way. Being a councillor is very much, it's bread and butter stuff. Dare I mention it, we used to say 3 things: bins, so rubbish, potholes, and dog crap. Yeah. And I've been on conferences and things down in England. You meet other councillors and you say, so what are they? It's bins, dogs. And but I'm pretty ashamed of the state of the roads in Edinburgh now, but let's not go there.
Yeah. Some things never change, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you do with yourself to fill your time these days, Stuart? I know you've written a book.
Yeah.
What's the book called?
I will leave it at that. And that expression actually comes from the anonymous self-help group where people, it goes round the room and people have the share as they call it. And you'll get these people that will say, I'll just leave it at that, or we'll leave it at that. Often you hear that, and you know full well that they won't leave it at that. But I'll just say this. So I think I say in the last chapter, at the end of it, I will leave it at that, I think. So that's a title that came to me, which was only meant to be a working title, but I kept it.
Yeah, and it's your life story. Is it something that you'd always planned to do, or was it just later years, just that if you've had a colourful life, you want to get it down? I
had about a 15-year... No, it started off with a few notes written in a school exercise book in pencil. And I just thought it might be future relatives,
Yeah.
And it hung about, and I went back to it. Then when I was in the council, and sorry, I must mention this chap's name, I think you know him, Jack Gillan, who's written a number of books about mainly architecture, places around Edinburgh and Lothians and Fife, because I was on the planning committee and I got to know him through that. So I told him, obviously at some point, that I'd written this thing. And sorry, when I was in Orkney, I went back to Orkney for a while, and I did try and become a politician up there as an independent, and I just missed out. I was beaten by a few votes. But anyway, so during that time, I'd written the book on my computer and downloaded onto flash drive, as you call it. And the Orcadian newspaper, which is a good newspaper, the weekly newspaper, but they did publishing stuff, and documents and all that. So I went to them, and they printed off three books, except they weren't quite sort of books in the sense that they had binding, plastic binding. Yeah. But they were books, and I paid for that. But not until I met Jack, and he said, well, how about trying to download to Amazon and do it properly, sort of thing. So that's what we eventually did. He really pushed me, and this book would never have been published but for Jack. And of course I had to revise it and keep revising it. So it's a much improved version of what the Orcadian did for me, newspaper. But, that was a step. So the whole thing, I think, took maybe over a period of 15, 16 years.
Yeah, and that's available on Amazon. We'll put a link in the notes for the podcast. Just a couple more questions, Stuart. I'm going to, in a mythical situation, when there's a lot of positives about the modern police force and the way the police is run these days compared to back in your day, but I think we've probably lost a lot of important stuff as well. What if you were put in charge of the police these days, what would you bring back?
Much stronger vetting, for a start. When I joined, my family and the references I gave were visited mostly by inspectors and sergeants, and that's in England and Scotland. I was joining the Met, but they were visited by the local police and, questions asked. And then we seem to be getting, what it ties in with is the fact that now we require officers to have a degree. And I think they're of a different type than not. I mean, we had some pretty raw people when I started, street kids, really, from the East End of London and so on. They used to leave us rural types or semi-rural way behind in many ways because they were so streetwise. So obviously we caught up. No, I think we need far more, and we had a lot of ex-military people. I do think we should look at them more. We need to get ordinary working class kids, as we used to call them, into the job. We're never going to get back to coppers, loads of coppers walking on the beat, but also priorities. And I think the police have got too bogged down in things, I'm afraid, like hate crimes and so on, stuff that's been on social media. 4 years ago, a friend of mine, ex-policeman, was in together at Fulham. He'd retired and became a driving instructor. So one day he's got a new learner, a young lady. So, as you do, you ask, and it turns out she's a probationary police officer. So he was driving because to go to sort of quiet streets where she could learn. So he said, I used to be a police officer. Oh, yeah. And he said, well, where are you based? And she said, well, Fulham. And he said, well, I was there, but the police station is shut down. And it turned out she worked in a sort of government building. So she'd been in the force, I think, just over a year. And she suddenly turned to him and she said, did you walk the beat? So my friend Dave, as I say, was driving. He said, I nearly crashed the car. Did I walk the beat? He said, I was still walking it when I retired. I never got promotion. And she said, what was it like? He said, well, pretty boring at times. You got wet and you got cold and then you had bits of excitement. I'd like to do that, she said. And it was just extraordinary.
Yeah, I would have thought that was part of everyone's training, but no.
Not now, it seems. But I really can't, and I know this from social media, that we talk to each other, us retired cops, and we don't really kind of know what the heck, how it works anymore.
Yeah.
It's completely different. But I think the vetting, there's been some very bad, sad cases. That awful murder with the serving police officer. That guy should never have been in the job. I don't want to mention his name. That certainly needs to be looked at. But we've got to get back, to use a phrase, to basics and say, look, we can't do that stuff. We can't do the, stuff that's on social media or whatever. We've got to deal with the basics of burglaries. Now, people don't get visited at all, usually, but burglaries and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So burglaries, robberies, street crime in particular. And I'm afraid it's got to be said in London, with the stabbings, so many are youngsters. It's drugs, involved in drugs, it's gangs. And unfortunately, it's often from the black communities, and they're killing each other. And I'm afraid, there has to be more stop and search. But that's frowned upon. It's racist or whatever you're picking on. But they're killing each other, sadly. There needs to be more concentration on that, I think. But people need to feel safe in the streets. It is pretty basic stuff.
Is that you're maybe too detached to know this, Stuart, but is the reduction in beat cops, is it purely manpower or is it a strategy and a policy partly as well?
I would say, I know there was a big reduction and the Tories are blamed for that in cops, but for many years, it started before I retired. I retired in 1994, putting more and more people into, like this young lady who was working in a tower block, a government sort of tower block, on some investigation or other, in front of a computer all day long. They're putting them into more and more sort of specialist units, but dealing with stuff that really, I don't know, and beat, I say walking the beat, but just being on the street, it's sort of been downgraded. It's sort of kind of frowned upon. I know that the young cops, I understand in London anyway, that the average length of service of the cops, and they call it response now, they don't call it beat cops, response, it's something like 3 years experience is sort of average. There's just so many different departments now, and that was started before I retired. So I think a lot of these have to be shut down or the work taken over by some sort of civilian units,
And how old are you now, Stuart?
78 next month, Valentine's Day.
And this is a question I ask all my guests. Are there any regrets for those 78 years? Apart from you've spoken, you've touched upon your sadness of your marriage coming to.
I tell you what, I feel very fortunate. And I know a lot of my ex-colleagues, and not just ex-police people, say, if you could pick a period of time, that I say, I'm 77 at the moment, 77 years, or pick a time to be born in the history, particularly of this country. By God, I know it was the end of the war, and I know my father was killed, but by goodness, didn't I pick, well, it wasn't down to me. I got the right, I think, the best period of history of this country to be born in. And I think it's not just me saying that. And not only that, I just said this country. You got the whole world. And I was fortunate enough to be born in the United Kingdom, the small country, which has done a heck of a lot over the years. A lot of good stuff. Oh, yes, also bad stuff. And not only the United Kingdom, but that part of the United Kingdom called Scotland. And not only that part of Scotland, but that part called Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And I know when I went to down south as training school as well, I kind of assumed, I loved Edinburgh, I was proud to be from Edinburgh, but I thought that everybody was proud to be from wherever they came from.
Yeah.
Leeds, maybe. Leicester. Don't know why I mentioned that. And, of course, I found out that there were people who said, God, I'm so glad to leave that place behind. I never want to see it again. So then I realised, wait a minute, Edinburgh is this special city.
Yeah.
So, yeah, regrets, of course you have some, but there's no good dwelling on that. I know that I've done a lot more good in this life than I've done bad stuff.
And finally, how would you like to be remembered? What does it say on the gravestone? Is there an epitaph?
I will leave it at that.
That's very fitting and a good plug to finish up on. Stuart McIvor and Stuart McIvor, thank you very much for joining us on Lifestory today.
Thanks very much indeed, Barry.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, there are further reminiscence and music shows, Leith Lives, Forgotten Songs from the Broom Cupboard, Dementia Stories, Queer Edinburgh The Tapes, and Analog Rory's Jukebox can all be accessed from the Projects tab on our website at www.livingmemory.org.uk or via Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Thelma Scotland and keep up with our regular events at the Wee Museum of Memory by searching for the Living Memory Association on Facebook. Our photo archive of over 5,000 pictures can be accessed through edinburghcollected.org, and there are a vast selection of great videos of the past on our YouTube channel at the Living Memory Association. Until next time, we bid you farewell.